in order to finish well, you got to make a lot of good decisions before you get to the end of the road. And yeah, there's some things to do when you're at the end of the road, but before that, it sure helps if you've made some good decisions. So we talk a lot about that on this show. We don't simply talk about the things you need to do with a lawyer in an office at a single point in time prior to your death. If you want to really succeed in terms of the things that you value, you need to start earlier.
Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. I'm broadcasting from Naples now, so when my wife and I try to spend some time in Naples each winter. And when I'm down here, I'm kind of on my own. So I have a little studio set up in our place, and I have to manage all the technology myself. So that means that it's arguably not done very well. Meanwhile, I have Justin, who is live and, of course, in the background. He's in our studios in St. Louis. So he's trying to manage this from there. He has suggested that perhaps he should be given an office here in Naples. I told him I would give that due consideration. But in any case, we make this work, but we do it in a much more limited way than we would be able to do it in our studio. So I hope you won't detect any of those challenges. The subject we want to talk about today is Diane Keaton. Diane Keaton is a name that I think will be familiar to all of you. But just for those who don't remember the name or don't know enough about it, Diane Keaton was a big star in especially the 70s, very, very influential. She's associated to a great extent with Woody Allen because she did a number of pictures with him. But she's a good example of someone who was very successful in terms of the way they managed their lives, and also the way they managed the thereafter as far as what they've contributed in this world and those people they care about in this world. So she's a positive role model. Too often we have role models that are simply, we learn by thinking this is not what we want to do. There's a bunch of those. And to be frank with you, they're probably more interesting for some of us. And I think that it's helpful to look at people who we see as great role models who they did it right, and we want to do it that way. So it's a positive example rather than a negative example. But we do both, and both are important in life. So a little bit of background. She lived in LA pretty much her entire life. She was born in 1946. She was interested in acting from an early age. The only time, in fact, during her entire life that she left California in terms of living was a period, and I guess it was from about 67 to 70 or so when she was in New York. She acted on Broadway, as a matter of fact, in the original production of Hair. Those of you who might be old enough to have seen that. She was immediately recognized as a fine actress. Soon, of course, opportunities start appearing in California, which she wanted to get back to California. It was the place where she would choose to spend the rest of her life. And so she gets back there. She does a picture in 70 or so. That was her first film. It was her film debut, but it wasn't particularly successful. I think it was The Lovers and Other Strangers. But then in 72, she got her big breakthrough role, which I'm hoping all of you have seen Godfather. And this is Godfather 1, but called Godfather. This was the role where she really shined. She got recognition by critics. She simply did a wonderful job in this very emotional role. And so she ultimately was in, I know she was in one other Godfather, which was Godfather 2. And she might have been in 3 as well. Anyway, another role that she was largely known for is Annie Hall. Annie Hall was a Woody Allen picture. Many of you have seen that. She was, in fact, in 8 Woody Allen movies. Woody Allen loved her as an actress. And I think she dated him for a while, so I think that they had a relationship of sorts. But Woody Allen speaks well of her, that Woody Allen, she was definitely one of his favorite actors, I would say. And then she kind of set a style trend in the U.S. No one foresaw and no one, quite frankly, can explain, I don't think, satisfactorily the influence that she had on fashion in the 70s. She just had this style about her. Let's see, Annie Hall actually came out in late 70s, 77. So for about the next at least 5, 6 years, there was this look, and it was the Annie Hall look. She had this kind of unconventional, casual, kind of thrown together, it appeared, look that caught on, and it had a certain charm to it. So throughout the remainder of her life, she continued to be influential in terms of style as well as fashion. Maybe later in terms of style, she wrote about it. She was someone that people watched in terms of where she was living, what she was doing, important things in her life. So she was an early influencer, for lack of a better way to put it. She won an Academy Award, by the way, for her role in Annie Hall. Then she's in Reds. These are her most prominent. She's in probably 30 plus movies, but Reds, it was critically acclaimed, and real success at the box office. Father of the Bride, I hope you all have seen that. It is incredibly funny. She has this great comedic sense. Something's Got to Give, which was golden. She was nominated Golden Globe Award there as an actress, but she also produced that, and I think may have directed it as well. So she earned a lot of money during the course of her career, and that's important for our purposes here. In order to finish well, you got to make a lot of good decisions before you get to the end of the road. And yeah, there's some things to do when you're at the end of the road. But before that, it sure helps if you've made some good decisions. So we talk a lot about that on this show. We don't simply talk about the things you need to do with a lawyer in an office at a single point in time prior to your death. If you want to really succeed in terms of the things that you value, you need to start earlier. And I think all of us know that, but it's good to be reminded. In her case, it's just an example of how her income rose dramatically. I found this bit of information somewhere. In The Godfather, the original 72. So remember, she wasn't very well known at the time. Now, granted, there's inflation and stuff, but even when you allow for the inflation, these numbers are shocking. She was paid simply a salary. She didn't have residuals or anything. So she had a salary, and it was roughly $7,000 to $10,000. And of course, she didn't have any participation in that, what we call back end points. None of that. All she had was a salary, which she didn't command any power at that time. So now let's move forward. 18 years later, 1990, Godfather Part 3. So that she was in 1, 2, and 3. Part 3, by the third installment, her contract, by that point, reflected, her influence. And you can see this. And all we could find were some legal documents, and these were from 89, and they show a paid base salary of $1.75 million. Plus, she got compensation for overage, which means to the extent that there's additional time required on the film, then she gets $125,000 per week. Now, this is 1990 money, so you can see the big jump in 18 years. There's a little bit of an inflationary period, but the bottom line is, she was a success from the beginning. The moment she got her chance to appear in a big way, which she did in Godfather, then immediately she was recognized as a talent. Lots of jobs came her way. She was picky about the jobs she took. She had a directing and producing credits. These should be mentioned because this was very influential in terms of her net worth at the end, was the money associated with sharing in what's called back-end points. I'll explain a little bit of that in a second. Something's Got to Give. And Palms. I don't know Palms. Unstrung Heroes, Hanging Up. She was executive producer and or director. So these roles allow her to get producer fees, which I'll pause for a minute and talk about this compensation. When you're getting compensated as an actor, the first one way you get compensated, of course, is in your salary. In other words, there's a specific sum that you are paid at a point in time, flat fee, so to speak. And then the other piece is you can have what's called back-end points. And back-end points means you're pretty influential. Tom Cruise commands that. There are, Marlon Brando in an earlier day commanded that. Lots of actors, if you think of a very prominent actor, they probably have back end points. So what that means is that they get a percent of the revenues it can either be gross profits or it can be net profits. They want to have gross profits or even gross revenues because of the manipulations that some of you've read about in litigation. You've seen actors complain about it who maybe didn't pursue it in court because it's so expensive to fight the studios. There's just a lot of room for the accountants to play with it. And historically, in the 50s, when you started seeing some of these deals, 60s, notoriously, the accountants accounted for it in such a way to where there was no gross profit or there was dramatically less net profit. And to the extent you're dealing with gross revenues, it's really hard to manipulate that. That's a sum that came in terms of ticket sales or in terms of payments from studios or cable outlets or whoever is airing the films. So in that case, you can be sure that the accounting is going to be accurate pretty much. So that's what everyone would like to have, and that's what the biggest stars manage to get. And another advantage of that, too, is it's not dependent on whether they actually made money. It's a percent based on gross. Now, obviously, it's a much lower percentage because the studios have to allow for the possibility that it may not be as profitable and you still have money coming in and they'd just be going deeper in the hole. So in some cases, we know that Diane Keaton had this arrangement. We know she had it with respect to those roles, of course, where she directed and produced. I don't know whether she had it in her acting roles. My suspicion is that she probably commanded that in some of those later roles that were very influential, but we don't know that. I didn't get access to any records. But when you think about actors' compensation over the course of a career, you think about, I mentioned first the salary, I mentioned second the fact that you get back end points, but again, that doesn't apply by any means to every actor. So it depends on if it's based on gross, is it based on net operating income, or is it based on net income? Now, the third category, which is the most common and now by union contract, will apply to virtually all actors who have what's called a prominent role in a movie. If they're a prominent participant in the movie, as that's defined, that means somebody who has lines, a few other, it's some technical definitions. But if you meet that definition, then you are eligible to receive residuals. And residuals, they peter out over time, but they can continue beyond 50 years. And those are based upon a percentage, or they're determined by the amount of salary you received. So those who received a high compensation at the time that they were hired for the movie, so on the front end payments, those are served as a percentage for determining how much they will be getting in terms of this residual income. But residual income just, it's almost evergreen. It just keeps paying. It's the source of the luxurious lifestyle of many actors who no longer have roles. They continue to live out their lives in comfort, and it's largely because of these residuals. So we know that she had a number of those as well. So let's go ahead and move on to talk a little bit about her family before we talk about her later in life. In her case, when we talk about family, we are talking about later in life because it's very interesting that Diane Keaton never married. She dated Woody Allen, she dated Al Pacino, she dated Warren Beatty, but apparently she had no desire to marry. I mean, obviously she could have married. She chose to stay single, and she didn't have any desire for children either. She's pretty firm about that early in her career. But she talks about this later in her journal, and she wrote a book in which she described her life. And well, I don't remember the name of the book, but let's go ahead and put the book on as a link so people can read more. But anyway, she talks about how she reached around the age of 50, I guess, and she decides that she wants to have kids. So then, the way in which you'd have kids would be more limited. So she adopted 2 children in her 50s. These were infants. These were not 10-year-old kids. They were adopted in the United States. One was adopted in 95. That was Dexter, the girl. Another was adopted in 2000. That was Duke, the boy. By all accounts, the 3 of them had a wonderful relationship. which we know sometimes adoptions can go wrong in the teen years, or at least some of us hear those stories. We don't hear enough of stories where they go right and they're wonderful. But for her, it was really wonderful. I mean, but everything I can find indicates, plus what the kids said, Dexter and Duke, around the time of her death, leading up to her death and thereafter, in praising her and in memorializing her. Yeah, I think that that this is a case where she adopted two children. She was older in life, and it was a decision that was perhaps the best she ever made in her life, and and they added a lot to her later years. They continued to be nearby. They each have careers, not outstanding careers. One was in veterinarian. She had a veterinarian tech degree, I think a 2-year degree from a university there in California. Duke, I think that was Dexter. Duke, I'm not sure what he's doing, but he's employed and no indication of having life problems. And now we should say that also, though, about Diane Keaton is we know all the ways that you can go wrong in life. And those are magnified often when you have lots of money and power and influence. A lot of people just really self-destruct at a much faster pace than they would have in any other situation. As a matter of fact, they may not have self-destructed had they not found themselves in fame and riches. But those who manage to have those things available to them and still live their life in a disciplined, orderly, reasonable way, you just have to respect it. And Diane Keaton is one of those. So during her life, she was always a saver. She never lived lavishly, although she did live in great homes, but even that ties in with her net worth in the end. Before we talk about her death and estate, I have to talk about another component of her estate that was very influential in its value. She developed an interest in flipping houses. Of course, when somebody in her situation chooses to flip houses, especially in California, those houses often tend to be very nice houses, not the sort of house flipping that many of us are familiar with in our towns and cities. She bought a number of houses that turned out to be really, really profitable. And so much so that she got this reputation as this very successful flipper. And she would go in hands on and do a lot of this stuff. It's not as if she's doing this, from another city and she's dictating or hiring people simply to go and do these tasks, whether it's plumbers, whether it's drywallers, the flooring, installation of pool, all those things that you associate when you're doing some sort of major rehab of a house. Well, she did it and she was on the property, on site, in some cases doing some of the work herself, painting and other things. So she really did this, I think, as much as a hobby, as a source of enjoyment, as a source of profit. Clearly, she didn't have to have the money. But just a few of the properties that I know about, she had bought a property, it's called the Samuel Navarro House, and she bought this in the mid 80s. We don't know couldn't find what she paid, but she sold it in 94, and it looks like we don't know the sale price either. But apparently it's very profitable. She turned that money over, flipped it over, bought a house in Bel Air. This was a mansion. So we know this was a very high-end property. The other one had to be too, because it was Frank Lloyd Wright's son, A. Lloyd Wright, who was the designer of the property, the Samuel Navarro House. So anyway, then she goes from that to the Bel Air Mansion, which she bought in around 2000, purchase price $8 million, and she sold it for $16 million. We don't know exactly what she spent fixing it up, but clearly it was profitable. And matter of fact, she talked in interviews about how much fun she was having and how it was very profitable for her. And she wasn't one given to boasting. So a Spanish-style restoration, and she essentially doubled her money. So then there's this Laguna Beach estate that would have been immediately thereafter, or even before she sold the other one. She paid 7.5 for it. sold it 2 years later for 12.7, and this was an oceanfront property. So she had it for 2 years. Whatever she did over that 2 year period. But I'm willing to bet that she didn't put an additional, $5 million in it. And then there's the Pacific Palisades, 5.6 million. This was in 2012. Sold it for 6.9. And we think that was a profit. So it calls it a profit. It says $1.3 million profit. So not bad. And then the one that she didn't actually sell during her lifetime, but there was an intention to sell it because she had listed it at one point. But it ended up being part of her estate, and I don't know if it's actually sold now. It's on the market as recently as a month ago. It was relisted in December. But anyway, so this property was 9,000 square feet. She bought the land itself, essentially. So the house was kind of like a tear down, I think, and it was for $4.7 million. So it must have had a great view. She spent 8 years on what's called a gut renovation. So there's probably a tear down on the property, meaning she bought it for the value of the lot. And she managed to take that structure, preserve some of it, and she called it, what is it? I think she called this place the house that Pinterest built, because she decided there's lots of interest in this subject. So again, she was influential. She had this hobby. People latch on to what she's doing. And so suddenly she had this big following on Pinterest as she described the process of doing this renovation. I'm sure you can find this. And she also talked about it in her book, which we will link the book. Current status, so it's been listed, and it's relisted for 26.9 million. Call it 27 million. So here you have a house that we don't know how much she put into it. So she probably put, maybe 10 million into it. Who knows? But I wouldn't think more than that. But this was probably her most profitable deal. It was in Sullivan Canyon. Most profitable deal, and it goes to people she cared about, her children. Which, let's get to the estate planning piece. So Diane Keaton was a planner, and she planned her life very well in a very disciplined way. And it's contrary to the personality that projects on the screen. You think of someone that's a little que sera, sera, a kind of somebody who kind of goes with the flow a little bit. She projects that personality as part of her charm, but in fact, she had very clear ideas, and she pretty much, I think she would agree, lived her life as planned. And in the end, she wanted to be sure that her estate planning was in place. She had a dog. She's a big fan of pets. She gave a lot of money to pets over the years, and through these various donations. So she created 2 trusts, we believe. And I'll issue the caveat here that I often do on this show. Whenever people do as they should, most of their planning with trusts, and they put all their important assets into those trusts, then it makes it very difficult for us to know the details of the trust unless they voluntarily disclose it, because it's not filed publicly, unlike a will. So it means that the information I get, I think, are from comments that were made by her, comments perhaps that would not have been a breach of confidentiality by her attorneys, by her friends. So you have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt some of the detail. We're confident about the main features of her estate plan, but there are details we don't know. But I'm pretty confident, very confident, that this would be the way she would do it, because it's what makes sense. It's what somebody like her would do. So she created a trust for the dog. What was this dog's name? Justin, do you have it in front of you? Reggie. No, we're good. A distinct part of her estate included, so there's $5 million trust for golden retriever Reggie. $5 million. Now, California permits the creation of a pet trust. This is, and a number of states do. It's made its way into the Uniform Trust Code pretty much across the country. Not all states have adopted it, but a numbers have this subsection in which they there's a way for you to enforce it. Historically, unless there was a benefit specifically for a human being or an entity that was recognized as a quote unquote person, then there was no way to enforce it. So you would essentially be leaving money to a friend and saying, please use this money to take care of my kid or my dog, but there's no way to enforce it. So this was something that, given America's love of animals, maybe the West generally, since people really care about assuring their pets are taken care of after their death, there needs to be a legal mechanism to assure that. So there is. So it's not the trustee who has the responsibility. You name a person who is the caregiver, and then that person sort of reports from a financial standpoint to the trustee, and the trustee manages the money. So if there's money left in the fund, then that money can be directed, as I'm sure in her case it was, to go specifically into the other trust. Were there no instructions, then it could default by as if she had died without a will. So in what people do when they create these trusts is they do have a provision that whatever funds are left, those funds shall go to whatever. They can either name a person or they can name a trust. And I'm confident that the residue went to this trust. So for Diane Keaton, there are really two people in her life that she really intended to benefit financially after her death, as far as we know, and that was her two children. And she was smart enough to put her assets into the trust and to arrange for professional managers within the trust to manage it. Now, we don't know the term that these assets will be held as to be managed for the benefit of the children. We don't know the term for that, but I'd like to think that she extended this for decades so that the children get the best benefit, meaning the money is protected, and yet there are probably liberal terms provided to the trustee to assure that they can have liberal access as needed. So they have the best of all worlds. They're protected from lawsuits. They're protected from divorces. They're protected from all those things that can dramatically reduce your wealth, and that is a source of the great depletions that we've seen in wealth among the wealthy we've talked about on this show. When we look at those great holes in the bucket, they earned a lot of money, most of these people, and they get to the finish line, and too many of them just have very little left, and in some cases have nothing left. And when you look back, you see that, yeah, there was money coming in, but this is how it went out. And often it's related to divorce. Not always, but often. And then other, of course, bad lifestyle decisions, addictions, things like that. Things that also should be mentioned. Diane Keaton didn't have these problems either. And these notoriously explain a lot of the losses of wealth that we see on the show. So in her case, she created this trust. She made the provision for the kids. And then she put the assets in there under terms that would allow their continued management, as opposed to simply requiring everything to be distributed from day one. I mean, when you liquidate like that, then it can and typically does mean that there's a discount on what you receive for the property. One thing that should be mentioned is quite a number of years before her death, she created an entity which was intended to manage primarily all the revenues related to her acting career, to her film performance, et cetera. And that includes things where it would be just payments, direct payments, single payments through participation in a show. It could be back-end points. It could be the continued inflow that will come from residuals. So this entity she created was called Blue Relief Inc. So the name, I think, so it was someone said, who was interviewed, who knew her, said she chose this name because she regarded what she did as a living for blues relief, meaning relief from the blues, meaning the entertainment is supposed to provide this escape for people. So blues relief. She created this entity. It was a corporation, wasn't an LLC, as a corporation. And she had there at least one employee, maybe probably several, whose job it was to do all the accounting and manage that the funds are paid as they should be. And we know from this show that you simply cannot trust that your residuals, for example, will be paid as they should be. You know, we talk about the chicanery that takes place in the bookkeeping often when you're paid on back-end points. Well, the same thing can happen in residuals. And we've had people on this show whose relatives, like children of stars that we all know, who talk about the fact that their parent in one case, a divorced mother. She was Glenn Campbell's ex-wife, had to go back to court, and her children did this on her behalf after she died too, to continue to try to enforce it. It turned out that there was a lot of money that hadn't been paid that she should have been paid. So the fact that there's an entity called Blue Relief, it really assures that this thing can be done properly. So Diane Keaton, took all the right steps, brought in professionals as needed to properly manage her business interests. Now, what I don't know is the extent to which Blue Relief managed the real estate. At the time of her death, she wasn't holding a lot of real estate. She had her home and I think two other properties. And then, of course, she had this $26 million property, which we know will be sold. Um, but she really didn't need a property manager per se. So Blue Relief was, I suspect, in a position to manage all of her assets that needed managing. And I'm confident that those shares, that interest, went into the trust. So the ownership of Blue Relief, the entity, would be owned by the trust, and the benefits paid out to the children. The reason this is important is that we will see money over the next decades flowing into her entity. They'll be paid to somebody because she's earned them and she deserves them. And that includes residuals as well as back end points. To the extent movies are still making money, then she still deserves that. She's an owner in that sense. And that can go on for decades and often does with movies. So the back end points as well as the residuals have to be monitored to assure they get paid correctly. So she created an entity for that purpose. She put it in the trust, and now the children are in a position to simply have money distributed to them after it's being handled by professionals, so that money doesn't get lost along the way. As we know, it very easily can. Uh, so I like the plan that she created. Also, it was fortuitous that she didn't go through a long period of incompetence at the end, but she had in place durable power of attorney. She had in place the mechanism through the trust so that she would initially be a co-trustee, but if she were to become incompetent, she would immediately have a successor co-trustee. And 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 what that allowed is that had she in fact gone through a long period of incompetence, which many of us do, more and more of us do today than you simply died 30 years ago, it seemed. But today, because of our technology and other things, there's a good chance that we'll all go through a significant period of incompetence. And during that period of time is often the most vulnerable period of your entire life. I mean, you may think, well, gee, I was vulnerable when I was competent because I made some bad decisions or things happened. That's when I was competent. Well, when I had the ability to make decisions. And so when you're incompetent, imagine how that's magnified. So she took the steps at the time she did her estate planning to put in place instruments. And these are easy to do and they're inexpensive, very inexpensive, to assure that, gee, had she had a stroke, had she had a heart attack or some other thing that to where she couldn't manage her affairs and that had gone on for a year, 2 years, 3 years, that's okay financially. I mean, she had enough to worry about with her health when you're in a situation like that, but you don't want to be thinking, oh my gosh, what's happening to the things that I've accumulated in this world, my resources. So she did all that. She put everything in place. Turned out that she contracted pneumonia, a bacteria related to pneumonia, and she died in October of last year. So it was after several weeks. People had seen her declining for a number of weeks, so it wasn't instant. But it was a surprise that she died. It wasn't as if people saw that she was on that path months before. She had been vibrant and active. So it really took place over a period of maybe 8 weeks or so, pretty much, as I've read the accounts. And it's not so bad. There wasn't much suffering that we've read about. She had around her the people she loved to the very end. They were with her two children, and I'm sure others. So this is a life to be admired, the management of a life to be admired, and an outcome that is positive for generations to come, I hope. So I hope this has been helpful and informative to you. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Let me mention here, be sure to click like and subscribe. The reason you hear that from any of the YouTubes that you watch or what other video sources is that it's influential. It helps us allow others to see it. So we ask you to hit like and subscribe. I hope to see you or to talk to you again soon. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell & Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.